Thank you very much also for your invitation and the opportunity it gives me to discover Tallinn and Estonia. A real pleasure, I must say. Good science. Can we define it? Can we do something with the notion of good science? Well, let me take some distance from the notion of excellence. I mean, nowadays the question is not to be or not to be. It is to be excellent or not to be. And I'm not sure I know what excellence really means. When you look at your etymological dictionary, you find that it comes from the Latin and it means to overtake. So it has this notion of growing all the time, which is certainly positive, and it has a notion of competition which is attached to it and which comes all the time. And I'll come back to this notion of competition in a while. But being a bit shy with excellence, let me just talk about good science. And first ask, what is good science? Because science is really something which is very broad. So is good science to bring fundamental results to the light? Yes, certainly. Is it to bring internationally recognized research results? It's not always the same. And actually what we've just heard about is about high bibliographic indices as a means of measuring the international recognition to science. Is it to bring a few people at the very top, or is it to have a sort of broad population of people who can contribute? Thinking a bit in the sense of your minister, saying that if you have more people, the sort of quality of the people will go down in average, of which one can possibly discuss. But anyway, is it applied or is it fundamental research? Is one better than the other? Should more funds go into one direction than the other? Or is it to have a scientific literate population in one's society? Is that something which is important in that game? And what about bringing science to decision-making processes? That is something which is requested from us, academies actually, and it is important. How much effort should we give to that aspect of our work? Teaching is also important. Quality in teaching, but where? In schools, small schools and big schools, in universities? And in which domains, again? Or should we do all of that? And I'm sure that you can come up with other examples or other aspects of science which are not listed in this series of points about science in general. And I think you should also ask yourself about the way of measuring that, and it's very interesting to see that this Swedish study actually, which has taken one aspect of this question, is a huge effort in the assessment of what it is. And it really means that assessment of what we do is not an easy exercise at all. So good science is certainly something which is multi-parameter. It's not something where you just have one line and it's bad and it's good and it's excellent. It just doesn't work like that. There is no way of defining just one quantity around that and say, well, that is good or that is excellent. What is good depends on the epoch. It's not the same now, and it was 20 years ago, and it'll be in 20 years, or 100 years, or a century, or whatever. It depends on the place, and it depends also on the community, and on the goals that you have set for your society in general. All of that needs to go into the definition of what you intend to do if you intend to do good science. And I think, just as an example, if you have to work with colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa, as we do also in Switzerland, certainly the definition of good science is not the same as what you do at the European Southern Observatory or what you do at CERN. It's not the same thing. You have to realize that. And again, the metrics to measure these things will be different in these different cases. But this being said, there are a few constants in these exercises. Whatever you want to define as good science for your community, people will be important. People will do that research. And that's not trivial at all, because in the modern world, our societies, our funders, they tend to prefer projects to people, actually. It's easy to stop funding a project at the end. It's flexible, so they say, although building up a capacity is always something that takes time. So I think this is a rather artificial way of phrasing the thing. But there is no long-term responsibility from the funder for the people who actually do the work and conduct the projects, because they can be dumped after a while. And actually, sometimes they are dumped. In the same spirit, it's relatively easy to obtain funding for short-term positions, for doctoral positions or for postdoctoral positions, which are again limited in time, don't bring with them a long-term responsibility. And in addition to that, youth is also so good always. So when you say, I'm funding youth, you always get good grades. But that does have drawbacks. And the drawbacks are actually that you do not give a long-term career path to the young people that you're going to fund in this way. You don't take their aspirations properly into account with this way of thinking. It makes an institute extremely difficult to lead, and that was also said a little while before, because the leaders in an institution where most of the money comes from outside can just get in the money and pay the salary or whatever the organization is done. But there is no real leadership which goes into there. And actually, in a system that is run in this way, you also don't have a strategy, because you just follow the project opportunities. You just follow where the money is. And I think that that is something which is extremely delicate, and where we collectively have to be very careful. But this being said, these are problems. They are real problems, but these projects are essential. If you don't have a project or a set of projects in a university or an institute, you don't do anything. So it is a question of balance. It is a very important sort of question of balance. What do I give to the institution? What do I give to the project? And that was also what was said a while before. I came with figures which are 2/3, 1/3. These figures are not that different from what was said before. It's just like that. Must say, I have zero competence to talk about the subject I'm talking about, you know. I'm an astrophysicist, and the growth of young scientists on neutron stars is something which is still rather far from our subject of interest. So don't take these figures, or actually these thoughts, with too much importance. They just reflect what I learned over the last few years from the bench. But anyway, I came with these figures, and they happen to be very close to what we were told. And I think it's true. I mean, you have to invest in people, in your institution, because that's what you mean, and you have to invest in the project, and the balance has to be somewhere, and it's a guess. And you must pay attention to the career prospects of people that you hire. I think that's, and I will come back to that. Now, if you invest in people, you need to select people. So you just take the best. It's easy. Except that the best is not an absolute term. The best will also depend on where you have put your balance in this first set of questions. Do you want good teachers? Do you want people who publish? Do you want people who share their science? Do you want blah, 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 blah. So the best will have a color that will have to depend on what you have defined as the goals for your community. Now, when you take part in these discussions to select the best, whatever the best now is expected to mean, you find that people rely an awful lot on numbers, because it's easy. Oh, his age factor is 35, that one is 33. I'm sure the guy with 35 is better than the guy with 33. Or he has so many publications, or so many citations, or the citations are in that journal, not in that other. I think all of that does say something about the people, but it's extremely easy to overstate the importance of these factors. And so you have to perform a judgment when you select somebody. A very politically incorrect word nowadays, because it's bound to be something which is subjective. It's bound to be arbitrary in a way. A judgment depends on the person who judges as much as on the person who is being assessed in that case. But nonetheless, it is a responsibility that one has to take above all these pseudo-objective criteria. And I think you also have to be a bit aware of these questions of money. It's not if somebody comes with lots of money at a point that it is necessarily the best for what you want to do. And again, that was emphasized a minute ago. I think you have to be very careful. It is indeed important because you need the project in a university, but it's not the sole criterion. I had a professor when I learned. He was an excellent physicist. He was actually so good a physicist that he published very little, because either it was so easy, trivial, everybody knows it's not worth publishing, or it was so difficult, he couldn't go into that. And so the road, the path between the two extremes was too narrow for him, so he didn't really publish. But he was somebody who was an excellent add-on to the university where he was. So it's something which is also extremely important. And then I think you always have to use outsiders in your selection. If you do that inside, then you have this inbreeding sort of problem. You need people to question the people who actually make the selection from the inside. That's always to be stressed. Competition. Competition is an Anglo-Saxon god who was born some time ago between Cambridge and Oxford, and to whom we sacrifice an awful lot, and possibly too much, I think. So it's seen to be the tool to achieve quality, excellence, or whatever. And it's true in a way. Without competition, you don't get anywhere. That certainly is true. But you can overdo it. And in some cases, we do overdo that. If you look at the European space program, you find people who have been making simulations of different types of objects with one instrument after the other, which was never realized. An awful lot of waste of studies, efforts, and competence which went into projects which never saw the light. And I think that that's something which we, as a community, in that sense now the European space community, have made wrong. We've just put too much into that competition, and we don't get as many results as we ought to from the efforts that we've put in there. So it can be overdone. And I think we also slowly start to realize that the competition to get these few jobs which are around on permanent basis also is such that our colleagues tend to overstate their results to a level which is beginning to be hampering the credibility of our community, the scientific community as a whole. And I think we have to be extremely careful on that. People claim that the number of results that you find in high impact journals are actually often overstated, and too often overstated, if not plainly on the wrong side. So I think there is really something which is extremely delicate in the culture that we have in this game. So again, a question of balance, because we do need that, but we shouldn't overdo it. And then funding. Yes, indeed, money is something which is important in that game. So people need to be funded, so they need to have salaries. And I'd like to stress the need for these salaries to be decent. I mean, researchers, people who go through a PhD, are the best formed people that we have in our society. They bring to society in general an immense value, and yet they often miserably paid. Well, miserably is maybe too hard a word. But I was visiting institutes in Italy sometime, and I found people with salaries which were below what you need to live in the cities in which they were. And a state that pays its researchers like that really tells them, if you're dumb enough to stay in science, do it. And I think that that's wrong. And I think that we, as a community, should actually have the dignity to say that we and the young people after us ought to receive reasonable salaries for the work that they do. And I'd like to say also something about gender balance in this case. One can talk as much as one wants about models, role models and things like that. But if you're a young family with children, you need to pay somebody to take care of your children while you do the work that is necessary for the competition that we just discussed. And if I can remind you of one thing, and that is that children are small before being big. And when they're small, they require a lot of attention. And so the salaries must be sufficient when the people, the mothers and the fathers, are young and the children are small, for them to be able to pay for that. If we don't do that, all the rest is unnecessary. This is certainly not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition. And I think that that's something which is important. And again, when you go to projects, it's valueless to fund too many projects at an under critical level. I also had the opportunity to take part in project selection for the Irish Science Foundation, and there the funds that were allocated to the different projects were 3/4 of a salary or something like that, and clearly the people who got that didn't have the tools in their hands to do a proper job. So if you want people to just spend their time applying for money, make sure that they don't get enough money out of the system that you give them. But that is not the best way to use that. And I think that that's something which is also important. Private versus public funding. That's a place where we have a very lively discussion in Switzerland. And we have that because the bank UBS has funded a big finance institute within the University of Zurich. And UBS doesn't have exactly the best reputation in all fields, and so a number of professors have taken issue with that and say, well, we should look into these questions, although there are many other examples of extremely well-functioning elements in that. So that's the frame in which this discussion takes place now in Switzerland. But one should also know that in Switzerland, actually, if you take the sum of the money which is spent for research, you find that 2/3 of that is within private hands and 1/3 is in public hands. And that within universities, you have something which is probably between 5 and 20% which is privately funded. I said 1/3, 2/3 before, but it's because part of the funds that come from outside come from the Swiss Science Foundation and not from private money, okay? So these numbers are also difficult to assess. Don't quote me too much on these numbers. But anyway, that's what we have. Now, research is fundamental knowledge, but it is also power. And it is actually brute power. If you look at the biological scene and at the agro-industry, you find that the agro-industries commands the seeds, but those who command the seed command what we eat. So there is a huge power which is behind that and which goes together with the knowledge which is acquired with the research that is being done in this way. So one has to be a bit careful about knowing to which hands this knowledge is given, or actually in the balance between the public and the private funding in these sort of things. Knowing that the knowledge which is acquired within private concerns is not available to the public, and it is also not available necessarily in the decision-making processes as we need them. So there is something there which is extremely delicate and where we have to be careful, remembering also that fundamental results can have an immense influence on the well-being of a society. I mean, one always talks about the GPS and general relativity, but try to assess the impact that Copernicus had on our societies and the way in which we developed, something which is unmeasurable. And I think that that's also something to keep into memory. Knowing that society in general now, everywhere, pushes for less public efforts and more private effort. We can try to analyze why this is, and so I think in view of what precedes that, one has to be very careful with these sort of developments, but it is a trend in our societies that we cannot just stop like that. So we have to yield to that pressure in some way, but be extremely aware of what that means. And in this frame, I'd like to just add a sentence about this private and public business, because people like me or in academies are asked to give advice. And they are now often accused of being actually paid for or influenced by big industries in many ways, and it is something which is very difficult to resist and to see what it means, because one asks independent advice from these scientists. On the other side, one asks them to be engaged in society, and one asks them to work also with private funds. So one is asking from the scientists something which is often a bit self-contradictory. And again, we can't do much about that, but I think we should be extremely aware of these questions. So to return to the actual research world in that way, often people ask, well, should we do top-down or bottom-up sort of research? And again, the question here will be answered differently at different times, different societies, It is legitimate now that society or state asks from our community to do research about energy, or to do research about genetics, or to do research about very particular problems of our societies. I think that's fine. But in this game, it's also extremely important that once the question has been asked, the way in which to approach the answer be again bottom-up. So you can have all these questions, but do let the community try to find the best ways. I mean, don't try to micromanage within these sort of questions. I think that that's important. And again, make an extensive use of international, so outside peer review, in order to assess what you're doing. Peer review is not perfect, but up to now it's the best that we have found in this way. So I'd like to come back to this question of career prospects, which I do think is very important. Because again, all these projects and short-term positions, which are relatively easy to obtain, you have one after the other, and then you reach sometime when you're 45 or 50, and you still haven't found it, or you haven't found a home where you can continue to develop yourself. These permanent positions are extremely difficult. And many young people now, they say, I don't want to lead that sort of life. I don't want to just go from one place to another, not knowing what I'm going to do next year, not being able to have a proper family, and not being able to have a future somewhere. So we are losing excellent people in that game. It is a problem in Switzerland, but I think it is a problem in Europe in general, in a large way. I think we have to bear that in mind. If we want to keep the young people interested in what we are doing, we shouldn't just put them in a position when they're 20 and keep them there until they're 65 or 70. But we must have a reasonable approach to a professional life, pretty much in the same way as you would do in a large concern. So that was, in a way, the fostering. And how can we promote that good science? Well, that's also something which is extremely important. It requires that all what you've done to define your good science, you've done right, because you have to do it properly. You have to realize that you're at the service of society, which is not to mean that you're at the service of economy. That's very different issues in this thing. You are at the service of society in general. I think that's right. And then you have to communicate that properly. And this communication is not just a sort of effort from the researcher or from the professor to tell the world what they have done and how great it is, etc. It is also a question of listening to the questions that come up from the society to us. And this is very difficult because these questions don't come in our language. They come in a different way. They come across our boundaries. They come in rough terms. They come in half-understood words. And we have to try to make sense of what we hear from society in general and be able then to try to respond to that in as honest as possible a way. So it is really a delicate effort, and it's not because there is only one transparency on that in my presentation that it is a minor aspect in the thinking that we should have. So if we summarize, can we define good science? Well, yes, I think we can, but it is not something which is trivial to do. It depends on the context, depends on the time, depends on what we want. Can we foster good science? Well, certainly we can. There are a number of handles that need to be tweaked in this game. But again, none of these handles are simple. All parameters can be pushed too far, I think, and balance is the most important notion in all what I've said, and I think in all what is. And this balance is not acquired once. You don't reach an equilibrium. It will always move, because society moves around. So you have to adapt your balance all the time, top down versus bottom up. All these things you will have to change as time goes, and you have to keep this flexibility in your thinking. And then can we promote good science? Yes, certainly we can promote good science, but it takes a large effort on many of us, and it should probably take a larger effort than what we have been doing in the past. And a very last word on assessment, because indeed it must be assessed. We can't just say, well, we're the best, aren't we? We are, but still. So it needs to be assessed, but this assessment needs a lot of care. And I think we have to be very careful of these rankings which are now being proposed and which go big in journals and periodica and for students and things like that. I think we owe ourselves a better effort than that. And none of that is one-dimensional. We have to play with many parameters, but then we were trained as scientists, weren't we? Thank you.